Hi, my name is Dr. Ijeoma Nwaogu. I am currently in New York City at the NASPA Region 2 conference, and I'm joined here by, and I'm going to allow him to introduce himself.
Hi, my name is Dr. Vijay Pendakur. I serve as an Associate Vice President at California State University, Fullerton in Southern California.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Vijay, if I may call you that.
Sure.
I really wanted to interview you about leadership because I think you're a very inspirational figure in the field of student affairs. I had the privilege of attending one of his keynotes, and he's outstanding. And I think there's a lot to learn from his experiences and just his perspectives on leadership. So I have a couple of questions that I want to ask you, if that'll be okay.
Sure.
What has been one of the most meaningful experiences you've had that developed your leadership characteristics and your abilities?
I think for me, one of my first supervisors in the field had a really profound impact on what it means to me to be a leader. She really role modeled setting a really high standard for the amount of work that gets done, but not letting go of the fact that process matters. And so from the start, she paid a lot of attention to people and human dignity and how people's dignity was either lifted or diminished as a result of the process that you use. And she would coach me all the time around the fact that people matter, and that if you develop processes that get the job done but that run over people, that social justice is both the outcome and the process. And I think that's really been pretty powerful for me, because as I've developed into a leader, I've really tried to keep a keen eye to how people feel as a result of the work that we do. And if they feel empowered, uplifted, and able to be their best selves, then I know that the process is a just process, and hopefully the outcome as well.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So in thinking about leadership and reflecting on your own experiences or things that you've heard, what do you think really holds people back from pursuing leadership opportunities or seeing themselves as leaders?
As a critical race theorist, I can't help but think about the issues people of color face when considering leadership. And so, in higher education, and I think in our society, leadership is still seen as something positional. So leadership is the big job, right? And so whether that be president or vice president or somebody who has the word chief or executive before their title, that's seen as leadership. And I think positional leadership is one of the most daunting things for people of color because of the history of racial exclusion in our country. And so when we look at leadership as a positional game to be played or problem to be solved, it actually creates all this imposter syndrome that comes up and says, well, I can't be, nobody who looks like me has ever been, nobody in my family has ever been. And so one of the most important inversions that social justice educators and change agents have to make is that we have to start positioning leadership as a process and not a position. And so leadership as a process looks at social capital accumulation, how leadership is about the sort of behind the scenes, day-to-day incremental work of building structures, policies, systems, environments, learning opportunities that over time change students' experience in higher education, right? That's leadership, not just having the big job and the big title, right? Because that framework of leadership, also called the great men's model, it's haunted by a history of sort of cis heteropatriarchy, if you will, that doesn't allow us to imagine ourselves in that world. And so leadership as process is so much more empowering for marginalized group members, not just people of color, but women, but out members of the LGBT community, people with disabilities, everybody who is inadvertently obscured and excluded from the great men's model.
Yeah, I love that. Thinking of leadership as a process, not positional, right? And I love that you talk about imposter syndrome. That's a very key reality that I think a lot of leaders need to continue examining and things of that sort. So a lot of authors really argue that our current status in society is that we are undergoing a leadership crisis. Do you agree with that statement, or how do you feel about that particular statement?
You know, when I think about, and let me ask a clarification question if I can. Do you mean a leadership crisis within higher education or a leadership crisis in our country?
In our country, absolutely.
Okay.
And you could also reflect on higher education, because of course it certainly impacts all aspects of life, right?
Sure. Well, let me speak to higher education more specifically, because I think we can go, you know, in so many different directions when we talk about our large and complex nation. But in higher education, I do think that we are at a crossroads in which challenges that our leaders, particularly when you look at cabinet level, right? You know, the presidents, the VPs for finance, VPs for enrollment management, you know, VPs for student affairs, right? So there's if you look at this last year in higher education, what you see is a level of campus-based activism and protest that we haven't seen in our industry since the late 60s, right? And we have a group of leaders that are part of a generation that often wasn't prepared to deal with the issues, particularly the way that identity politics have rapidly evolved to represent a level of complexity around language, around representation. Millennials are significantly more progressive than boomers are and Gen Xers are, and so you have this huge culture gap between the students and the administrators. And so when you look at the number of protests, the number of direct actions, campus mobilizations that happened this last year, we do have a crisis facing our leadership. I don't know if it's a crisis of leadership, because I think that's a pretty harsh thing to say. Right? It's a harsh thing to say because that positions our leaders as uncaring, unknowledgeable, incompetent, and that's not necessarily true, right? Out of 4,000 colleges and universities in America, it would be a reductive generalization to say we have a crisis of leadership. Right? There are places where you have a crisis of leadership, but in a lot of places you have deeply caring, committed leaders who are facing a level of complexities and problems that are not easily solved.
Absolutely.
So I think we have crises that leadership will have to continue to evolve to successfully face and deal with. But I actually think that saying that we have a crisis of leadership is a really sort of damning indictment that isn't reflected, at least in the leaders that I know in our field.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Those are great insights. I do have one final question for you. If you were to describe the single greatest characteristic of a leader, what would that be?
I think the first word that comes to me when I think about the single greatest asset a leader can have is humility. For me, humility has been a key driver in being able to hear when people who care about me enough say, hey, I think you're making mistakes. Right? Without humility, it's, oh no, I got this, I know what I'm doing, you know what I mean? Like, oh, I'm an expert, right? All that ego, right, that can crop up and silence the voices that are saying, hey, I think that you might be about to step on in a pothole, you know, you don't hear any of that, right? And you see that all the time in our broader leadership culture in our country, right? The great men's model doesn't incorporate humility, to go back to my earlier answer, right? And so you have people that rise to greatness and then they start believing their own hype. Oh, I'm untouchable, I can walk on water, right? And then you see these massive scandals, whether they be ethical scandals, financial scandals, sexual impropriety, right? Where does all that come from? The ego. You know, so humility is the counterbalance to the ego, and it's something that allows a leader to be a couple of things. One, compassionate to those that are not being successful right now, which we need. Two, reflexive, meaning the ability to take feedback, to take learned experience and turn it into change, right, for our own capacity. And three, I think humility allows us to step back and not take ourselves so seriously, right? I mean, we need a lot more humor in our world, and humility allows us to laugh when things don't go as well as they should have, and maybe we were a part of why they didn't go so well. And so I think for me at least, a key driver for some of the successes I've experienced as a leader has been my humility.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Pendakur.
Absolutely. Thank you.
It's been great. I've learned so much from you. Yeah, any closing thoughts that you'd like to share?
You know, good luck with this project, and I think that's important to try and gather counter-narrative voices so that we can craft a new model of leadership for our society.
Well, thank you. I'm sure some of our viewers are already inspired by a lot of the things that you shared, your perspective, so thank you again.
Absolutely.